Let's this morning take a closer look at the polling in this U.S. presidential election and the campaign for that elusive low engagement voter. That chase is a key focus both for Kamala Harris and for Donald Trump, but getting out the vote that they know they have is key for both campaigns too.
We're seeing numbers, they're saying, wow, those are big numbers. So in fact, they set a record for the number of ballots today, right? Right? So if you have a ballot, return it immediately. If not, go tomorrow as soon as you can. Go to the polls and vote.
So as you hear there and see in that campaign event, Donald Trump and his campaign are shifting their message on early voting, either in person or by mail. That's a real break from his message in 2020 and back in 2016 when he attacked early voting and made false claims that tied it to election fraud. Get out the vote operations could be decisive in this election, especially with forecasts suggesting that a narrow band of voters in 7 battleground states will likely decide the outcome on November the 5th. So what are Americans thinking in these last days of the campaign? Scott Keeter is with me. He's a senior survey advisor, a senior fellow at Pew Research Center. He's in Washington, and we're going to talk polling this morning. Welcome, sir. I'm delighted to have you on the program today.
Thank you for having me, Heather.
We keep covering in our reporting on the U.S. election race. You know, we talk about the polls, tight, razor-thin margin between them, neck-and-neck horse race. So it's following the polling, but at the same time, wow, there's a little bit of skepticism. There's a little bit of leeriness. Are they right this time? Can we have faith in what we're seeing as far as the polling? Let's start at that point, and then we'll get into some techniques. But overall, can we trust in what we're hearing in polling right now?
Well, I wish I had a very clear and positive answer to that question, but the truth is we don't know. Polling historically, at least over the past 30 years or so in American presidential elections, has been quite good. But in 2016 and in 2020, the polls underestimated the support for Donald Trump, much as I think polling all across the Western world did with populist candidates. And even though the polls that are conducted in the off-year elections in the U.S. in 2018 and 2022 were quite accurate, it seems like there's something about Donald Trump's candidacy, the kinds of folks that he attracts, particularly low propensity voters, people who don't have a voting history, people who may be suspicious of institutions that sponsor polls. Something about that group of people has made it difficult to get accurate predictions. Now, pollsters have done a lot in the past 4 years. They've diversified their methods. They're using different methods, and we can get into details on that.
I was just going to let you finish that statement because you've raised a couple of things that I'd like to explore a little bit further. Number one, what you said about the Donald Trump supporter. You've done a fantastic background or piece I would urge people to look at from the Pew group in terms of the background to understanding polling. And that's what you're right. Compared with other elections in the past 20 years, polls have been less accurate when Donald Trump is on the ballot. Have you been able to determine what that is or why that is and what it is about the Donald Trump supporter that isn't captured accurately?
Well, a lot of attention has gone into this in postmortems done after both 2016 and 2020, and there was no smoking gun that could be identified. But it appears that people who are suspicious of institutions, who lack trust in government, are just simply less likely to want to take part in these polls that they see as a part of the establishment. That's a hard thing to correct for because you don't really know exactly who you're missing. The other aspect of this is that Trump was able to get people to the polls, especially in 2020, who hadn't voted in a long time, if at all. 25% of the people who voted in the 2020 presidential election had not voted in 2016. And pollsters didn't anticipate that. They didn't anticipate how many there'd be or how they would break down, which was basically about 50-50 between the candidates. So those are things that I think pollsters may have addressed more successfully this time. They don't think there are going to be as many new voters, but we don't know.
Exactly. No voters doesn't pick up. But that's part of a question that I want to ask. One of the new techniques that you said they're trying and have written about the data sources and interviewing approaches. something called weighted recall votes. This is something that's become much more prevalent since 2016. Explain to us what that is and how that could affect things, your view on that.
So if you think you're not getting an adequate number of Trump voters in your sample, one way, maybe an easy way to do that would be to ask people if they voted in the previous presidential election, and if so, who did they vote for? And if, for example, in your current polls, you have too many Biden voters relative to Trump voters, then you boost the share of the Trump voters statistically in your sample to correct for the fact that you've undersampled them. And that approach is being used by numerous American pollsters now, but it's controversial. In the past, it's had a mixed track record of success, in part because there is a suspicion that people don't remember accurately how they voted in the past. Now, for us as political junkies, that seems crazy, but there are a lot of people for whom politics just isn't that salient. And if they don't remember correctly who they voted for, then if you statistically adjust on that, you might make your sample worse.
But also it wouldn't reflect the new voters who haven't voted previously, too, that you just mentioned was key.
That's right. Yeah, you
so
wouldn't have any.
Are you opposed to this? If
them.
more and more organizations are using this and have since 2016, do you think it's problematic, obviously, in your view?
I don't know in this environment, given that Donald Trump, given that the U.S. public is so polarized between the Democrats and the Republicans, and Trump in particular, this technique may work very well. The other method is to try to adjust your sample on party affiliation, which is very highly correlated with how you're going to vote in the election. And a lot of organizations, including ours, are doing that to make sure that we're providing adequate representation of Republicans and conservatives.
When we talk about polling, we always want to remind people of the margin of error, and that's something that's changed too. So how is it coming into play? What do we need to keep in mind when everything seems to be so tight?
Well, the good news about margin of error is that it's a mathematical concept. It's based on the size of the sample that you have and a few other factors. And bigger polls are better in that respect, assuming that they've been selected with random samples. But I think one thing people don't realize, and the margin of error sometimes contributes to this problem, is that there are many other sources of errors in polls. I mean, we've been talking about one of them, which is not getting equal cooperation from the supporters of the two candidates. And those errors can contribute as much, if not more, to the overall error than the margin of error. So I think if you look at a poll and they say it's plus or minus 3, you ought to scooch that up by at least a couple of points before you freak out over the result or start celebrating if your candidate's ahead. Okay,
that's important context to keep in mind as we understand these numbers that we're reporting on and will up until the 5th. Given what we know of what happened in 2016 and 2020, what is keeping pollsters up at night right now, do you think, Scott, for 2024?
Well, it's definitely the question of whether we've found a way to capture the full share of the Trump supporters. You know, it's important to keep in mind, we're not talking about 10 or 20 point errors here. We're talking about 3 or 4 points. But in a country that's as evenly divided as the United States, in elections that have come down to just tens of thousands of votes in the critical states, errors of 1 or 2 or 3 percentage points are going to give you the wrong idea about who's going to win. And it may be that we're just asking polling in this kind of closely divided electorate to do more than it's capable of. It's still very capable of telling us who are the supporters of the candidates and what are the issues, but predictions in something like this situation, maybe not. That's what keeps me up.
So still a role to play, just perhaps a shifting role as we watch this. Thank you so much, because we are paying close attention, and now we'll understand the lens through which we should look at these numbers. I appreciate the time and your expertise, Scott Keeter. Thank you.
Thank you.